Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's special expanded Gartner panel discussion, focusing on a topic of great interest to all of us these days, remote work. And we're here to talk about leading through COVID-19, remote work now and beyond. Hi, I'm your moderator, Scott Smith. And before we get started, I have a few tips to help you enhance your webinar experience. Now, below the presentation view, you will see tabs that you can use throughout our program. Since this is discussion, there are no formal presentation slides for download, but we've included some resources to help you continue learning. You'll find them via the Attachments tab. I will be asking our panelists some questions, of course, throughout the webinar, but we especially want to ask them your questions. So make sure to get your questions and comments in through the Ask a Question tab. This panel discussion is being recorded. You can watch this presentation again and find more great insights on demand at gartner.com/webinars. All right, we have a lot to cover, so let's get right to our main event. And for that, I'm very pleased to welcome in our Gartner Remote Work Expert panel. We have Adam Preset, Senior Director Analyst, Ryan Hill, Senior Principal Advisory, Helen Poitevin, Vice President Analyst, Zach Hutto, Director Advisory, and Deborah Alvord, Senior Director Analyst. Everyone, welcome. And Deb, you were last introduced, but let's start with you. Let's face it, we all feel we were basically forced to move to a primarily remote work model in the last few weeks for good cause, and certainly at a scale that no one was planning on right now, if I'm wondering ever. How ready were most companies to handle even a basic expansion or introduction of remote work?
So the majority of the clients that we spoke to were not quite ready. Many had disaster recovery plans, but it didn't include government regulations for stay at home or a very infectious disease. And so those that were able to migrate quicker, they were more agile, were ones that had in their contingency plans work from home. And those who had practiced it for, once a month, for example, moving individuals to home. Those that continued to struggle or that did struggle to a work from home model were those who relied heavily on desktops within their locations and didn't have access to laptops. And so those were the ones that were more challenged with this.
Adam, let me turn to you with that same question on what you're hearing, because I know you've been fielding, to call it a large amount of inquiries right now would be an understatement.
That's right. And so when we look at what people were missing in terms of the technology, certainly we have to say Deb is spot on here, right? We know from our digital worker survey that we did in 2019, where we asked more than 7,000 digital workers, what they use when it comes to their workplace technology. About 30% of them said, well, they're desktop dominant, right? And so organizations were unprepared to deal with that part of the workforce in general. And there were only about 25% of us who were mostly mobile, who got our work done on mobile devices and on laptop computers. And so you think about this spectrum where everybody else is kind of in between using a mix of different devices. You really have to recognize that we were unprepared for a large part of the organization to take that move to remote work. And you can imagine that there are also people who had never worked from home before. And we looked at what people sort of like to do as well in this survey, and it turned out only 10% of the people said that they like to work from home, right? And the other 90% did not necessarily say they like to work from home. They like a mix of different things: working in an office, working in a co-working space, being flexible about where they work. And so now, that kind of big shift where you had to take a bunch of people who might not have wanted to work from home and have them adjust to that change, it's been really a challenge for everyone, as we know.
Let's dive a little deeper into that adjustment. Helen, who are you seeing having the harder time adjusting to really being an expanded remote workforce? Is it the employees or the employers?
I think it's a combination of the employees and managers. There's some really good stories coming from China, where they were the first ones to really be experiencing this, and talking through the managers' kind of not being very much at ease around how to support people when they were used to really watching them very closely at work. So if you take all of those desktop-based workers, they were used to be working in the same environment. They were attached to their desk where they were working, and the manager was probably very close by, co-located. And moving from having that direct interaction, being able to kind of lift your head and look over and see how people are doing, completely changes when they're distant. And what you see there is, on one side, employees feeling, oh my, this is getting into micromanagement, because they're asking constantly, how are things? How are things? Please report, please report, please report. And managers really feeling that they aren't able to manage. They don't know how to interact, and they ask questions about, well, should we be doing monitoring? Should we be automating things? Should we be actually asking them questions, or how do we support them? So I think in many ways with that, it feels like that manager role can be really, really struggling with this, especially if they were used to be co-located with their team and had that more supervisory approach to management, rather than kind of a manager in other teams where they were more of a kind of supporter, or looking to understand how they're achieving their goals and connecting them with others.
I want to bring Ryan and Zach in the conversation with this exact question, because Ryan, you come from the HR perspective, Zach, you have the legal side. And I think initially a lot of us looked at it as, this is a technical issue. How do we make sure everyone has connectivity properly? How do we make sure we have the right tools to be going back and forth? Very logical and immediate concerns. But Helen just pointed out there's that cultural aspect, there's the leadership aspect. Ryan, are you seeing maybe steps companies or even employees were not prepared for from that HR point of view that they're making adjustments for right now?
Yeah, absolutely. To kind of build off, a little bit of what Helen said, most of our managers were able to kind of look out and see their people. They were managing really to activities. And what we've really, for a large part of our knowledge workforce, had to do is shift to managing to outcomes. I would say more of our mature managers have been doing this for a long time. They set a goal, they let their people kind of solve the puzzle to get there. But for a lot of managers, this is a brand new experience where you can't just, like Helen said, pop your head up and look at your employees to manage those activities of what are you doing right now. You really have to set predefined outcomes and then manage to those outcomes along that way. And that's a fundamentally different type of thing if all you've done is walk into the same office and look at your employees every day.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I'd say, there certainly were logistical challenges among the corporate assurance functions with whom I work. So that is, in-house legal and compliance and audit functions. For instance, it is very hard to do business if we can't physically have a contract in our hands that's signed and we lack an e-signature product. Also, it is very difficult for an organization to operate under all kinds of service of process requirements if we can't receive subpoenas at a physical mailing address. But that said, from a risk management perspective, which is ultimately part of the core mandate that corporate legal and compliance functions care most about, it is a vastly different thing to try to manage risk and also empower frontline employees to take part in that first line of defense, if you subscribe to that model, if we cannot physically see our employees. Now, there have been some shifts over time that we've been seeing in terms of more distributed workforces, which have helped some legal and compliance leaders prepare for this to some extent, but certainly not to this scale. And there have been some huge disruptions with our inability, as both Helen and Ryan had pointed out, to physically see and interact with our employee populations.
I'm already seeing questions roll in for what do we do when we get beyond this first wave of pandemic response. We will be talking about that as we go through. That's not discouragement. Please get all your questions in. Fire away, folks out there in the audience. But let me pivot back to Adam with this next question here as we work on the strategy. As companies had to approach this remote work equation and had to approach it in a way maybe they weren't just not ready to solve at the moment, has there been a part they found they were most unprepared for, whether it was the technical side or the HR issues or so forth? Where have you found perhaps the initial struggles have come from?
Right. So it's really become clear that the organizations that were at least part of the way along their digital transformation journey were better prepared than those who had not had the time or energy to apply a lot of effort there. And so what I mean by that, from the technology perspective in particular, is if you already had a collaborative culture where you were used to using some tools that were more modern, and that could include everything from mobile messaging to like meeting solutions with video and audio and web conferencing to content collaboration platforms in the cloud where you can share files, to collaborative work management tools that you might use for better control and visibility over projects, you were in a better position to succeed with fewer hiccups. It was almost, I wouldn't say smooth, right? But there was certainly less friction. But if you were more traditional, right, you hadn't taken the time to push forward on those digital efforts, and you maybe were more wedded to traditional ways of collaborating with file servers, using email, using conference bridges, using on-premises apps, you had a much harder time, and you definitely weren't as well prepared. And so we've talked to clients all along the spectrum here, from the organizations that are most digital and virtual, who might have no physical company headquarters, all the way down to school districts where we're talking with teachers and principals who are used to sort of seeing each other in person and working with a lot of paper. And you can really see that the force that you need to apply to get to be purely digital is really quite severe if you hadn't taken those first steps.
Let me turn to an audience question here. It's, with a more permanent remote workforce, how do you predict that corporate cultures will change? And actually, let me bring it a little current. Are we seeing them already in some cases kind of starting to change some early stages? Ryan, let me turn to you first with that one.
Yeah, it's a great question because what we've kind of seen, if I kind of talk about what remote work looked like before this, it was kind of spotty. Most organizations had a policy, but it broke down somewhere in the organization and it wasn't big. And we kind of looked where we are now, where you have to justify going into work, and before you had to justify we're working remotely. So we've smashed through that stigma of remote work in the past. And as we look toward the future, it's not, are we all going to stay remote? Because we know we're not. People are going to come back to the office, and the way that we get there is going to be a little bit different for everyone. But when we come back, the big change that I'm looking for is, what is the new way that we're working? What is that optimal mix between virtual work and in-person work? It's going to vary company to company. And that's really the big decision that I see facing a lot of organizations as they tackle this.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in briefly and say that we've done a lot of research on this topic of corporate culture. And what we have found over time is that there's a pretty durable nature to culture as we think of it. However, that said, it's really the day-to-day climate for individuals, and that really is made up of interactions with one's team, the visible signals that they're getting from others. And that climate over time can eat away, or at least can change, broader, more durable corporate culture. The challenge that I see many of our clients facing right now is when there are limited signals, and signals that are purely conveyed virtually like we are right now, how can we ensure that the right kinds of signals are continuing, and how can we ensure that individuals aren't anchoring on perhaps less than ideal signals they may get from the day-to-day climate that could have long-term cultural impacts for our organization?
Deb, let me bring you in on this point of changing of culture changes, because one of the questions we did get right away was about what happens if we do go back to, call it, somewhat more of our old ways, or the ways we had done right up until a few weeks ago, of having people buy in. So let me rephrase that question in this way. What kind of a mindset should we be approaching it for say, some companies might be looking at this as simply a short-term impact, versus how do we balance that with that culture shift overall going forward?
Exactly. So pre-COVID, many companies did work from home for the benefits that they realized from it. We've seen reduction in employee attrition, reduction in absenteeism. Over half the companies that do work from home see actually an improvement in productivity, and employee satisfaction's increased, and so forth. So before all this happened, the companies that had work from home were really seeing benefits from this. And I think it's really important now, and this is also based on some clients that I've been speaking to in the last couple of weeks. Take a look at your performance. Take a look at how are you doing in terms of your CX and operationally and so forth, and customer satisfaction. Are there gaps in the technology that are enabling your employees to do the work that they need to do, or are you able to deliver on that service delivery that you want to provide your customers? So do a gap analysis with your technology, with your processes, take a look and see how your performance is doing, and then make the decision, is this something that you want to do going forwards? And I just think it's important that if you do decide this is something that you want to go forward with, then, in order for change to be sustainable, in order for you to positively influence the client, the culture with this, then you really need to explain the why. And so knowing those benefits, knowing how you've improved the customer experience, how you've improved the value, how you've improved service delivery, I think explaining the why and, what the future will look like will then help with that buy-in and the long-term sustainability of a change like this.
Helen, let's bring you back in. I think you had a point you were talking about with employee listening. You were mentioning it when it comes to this topic here.
Yeah, I'm building on what Deb just said about explaining the why. Part of it is explaining it, and part of it is knowing if it was heard. And there are a lot of techniques, survey techniques, pulse surveys, other kinds of techniques to really get a sense of how people really are feeling through this, what it is that they're understanding, and how they're working through this. And there's so many technology providers too in this space too, who have been very much promoting all of their pulse surveys, some things based on COVID, some things that they're already learning from some of the ways that their customers are actually using these technologies to reach out to those people that they're not seeing and saying, how is it going? Asking those questions, getting a sense of what they're feeling, how they're connecting in, if they're feeling that the organization is doing their best to keep them safe, or if they feel that the organization is not doing their best. All of this information is really essential just to know and get a sense. And part of that digital transformation that Adam was talking about is thinking about how you actually listen through digital means, because it's not just walking around the office to see. You actually have to make that effort to be asking questions, and those digital surveys are an important way to gauge where you are and to understand where the attitudes are. Because if your aim is to shift things and actually enable more remote working in the future, it's going to really help you to know what people's attitudes are, to be able to know even how you want to act on that. So I think surveys and what we call voice of the employee listening should definitely be in organizations' arsenals in terms of ways of connecting with their workers when they're not all together in the same place.
Ryan, I want to turn back to you for this next one. We had gotten a question in, a person had said that people who had been previously calling for more work from home opportunities were suddenly saying, no, we want to go back into the office. I have a longer range question about that. I must say, as a quick offshoot though, I teach once a week class of 7th graders, and they're all, of course, now we're doing it online, and they say, oh, I can't wait to go back to school. I never thought I'd say that. And so I asked them, okay, but the moment you go back to school, how long will you want to stay there? And there was a pause, and they all basically said, about 5 minutes, or as one kid said, my first math class, I'll want to go home again. I ask that from this point of view. You mentioned that we have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. Before we dive into more of the particulars of remote work and steps we can do, from a strategic point of view, as we go through this stage, what should we be looking at to determine where remote work might fit in with us longer term? How do we make sure we're keeping that long-term vision? Because we can't put the genie back in the bottle. There's going to be we're going to find there's not only a call for it in some cases, but we find it works better in some cases. But how do we make sure we don't either all rush to keep everyone at home or all rush back into the office when we didn't need to?
Yeah, it's a great point, because I think, just like the 7th graders, we're all going to get back there and we're going to be wondering why did I give up the time that I had at home? But no, I think you're really onto something in terms of what we see happening right now. We have been in crisis mode. We've been in this reactionary mode. Some of our research talks about when you're in a crisis, activity goes up. Your short-term thinking really amplifies, and you can't really get past that. As we kind of emerge from that and we get into a more long-term phase, the thing we need to be thinking about is, what are those activities that are best performed in a very collaborative in-person environment? Right now, that's the lens that I'm looking at a lot of these kinds of issues, is how do we identify those activities that are going to be best performed in person? What are those things that we start to do individually at home, using our collaboration tools to do virtually that are best suited? And I think going through for each organization and starting to think deliberately around, what are those things that previously we would fly people in for? If they're that important, then maybe those should continue to be our in-person. But for a lot of them, we're going to turn the dial back to, what? We actually found out that we were able to do this virtually. And there's a lot of benefits to that. There's some cost savings, there's time savings, there's engagement, and knowing whether we're going to be able to do that effectively.
Adam, we've been getting questions right away on infrastructure. It's actually not just, though, what do I need to make it happen? But what do we do to make it happen in a place where maybe the infrastructure beyond just the office is not as robust? I mean, I'm in the Northeast United States. I not only have a company that's provided me with the tools I need to work from home, but I've got an infrastructure, whether it's the Wi-Fi, et cetera, that enables me to do so on a rather healthy basis. The normal interruptions, but we have questions of like, what do we do in places like India? What do we do in other places around the world that are maybe not as strong as the USA right now in the infrastructure? How do we make that work? And especially in the short term, where they're demanded to be at home and they can't get into an office where they might have had those tools.
Right. So there's a part of me that says, we have to think of it as offline being the new online in a way. So this idea that any of the work that we have to have people do or enable people to do has to be accomplished with the resources that they have, assuming that sometimes they don't have connectivity or that they don't have great connectivity. And that also means often, to have a kind of a belt and suspenders approach when you need to do things like even have a remote meeting with someone, right? Because sometimes the meeting technology fails. So can you fall back on audio conferencing? Sometimes you can't get out to, the cloud service where you might be sharing files. So do you need to go back to, something that's a little bit old school, like email and attachments and so on? I know that is contrary to my earlier message about, how organizations that were sort of digitally transformed were better able to succeed in these times. But you do have to assume that things will fail once in a while, and you don't design for the perfect scenario. The perfect case in point for this was, so many of these organizations where maybe you didn't have laptops for everybody, right? And you couldn't sort of get them to people. What did they have to do very quickly? Well, they had to enable virtual desktop infrastructure or desktop as a service to give people access to resources, compute resources, using other devices like personal devices. And so they had to, protect access to critical business systems within the enterprise. And so that meant turning up a lot of virtual desktops when you couldn't give them laptops, right? Also, so many organizations, even not even thinking about commodity internet access, but worrying about getting people connected to their business applications. Turns out that they were sort of under-provisioned for their virtual private networks, right? So that meant that in a normal remote work model, you might expect, let's say, 200 connections to your company VPN at any given time, but all of a sudden you push 10,000 people to work from home, and they all need to get in, right? So a lot of people had to work very quickly to build capacity for some organizations, and some organizations still don't have the capacity within their own internal infrastructure to supply the demand for access to internal IT systems. You know, combining that with all these other things you need to do, like endpoint security, you know, making sure that you gave people like messaging technologies if they didn't already have that, or, you know, ways to make documents, right? Say you picked a cloud-centric document management tool of some kind. If there's no offline mode for that, you know, how do you work when you're not connected? So all of these things are, you know, essential elements of just establishing a workflow that will work for people when the network doesn't.
The question I have is actually for Zach, and it's really a reflection, as Adam was talking, I thought of it, and how interconnected everything becomes on the topic of remote work, which is a reason we have a diverse panel in terms of Gartner coverage areas to discuss this. As companies move to provide the tools or make sure employees have that ability to connect properly, where does the legal responsibility fall between company and employee? Because companies can only do so much at protecting the last point on the chain there. So where does, like, an employee, what kind of they have to put in place to ensure the employee takes a proper security measure, so you don't get that something we do on a regular basis in the office where we have VPNs, but now we're looking at it in a completely different manner for jobs we may not have initially planned on doing it remotely.
Yeah, that's a huge challenge for companies quite broadly, and it's something that we're seeing a lot of friction on right now as, you know, security endpoints and two-factor authentication, other means that have been used to protect company assets have worked incredibly well in, I think, as Adam had alluded to, that best case or ideal scenario. But as we get into the real world and as connectivity challenges arise, are people actually able to connect to the backend systems and platforms that they actually need to get work done? That has been a significant challenge. And what we're beginning to see in some cases is the proliferation of some of these more commodity applications, like a G Suite, for instance, or other tools that can help folks get work done in whatever way, shape, or form they possibly can. It will be rather telling to see how organizations respond to the proliferation of either consumer or general purpose technology, because, you know, for every document that's created by their remote work population, from a legal perspective, there will be a very real need to retain many of those documents to meet legal and regulatory obligations. And the way in which you do that, when you have thousands of individual personal Google accounts or Box accounts or what have you, looks and feels very different than the way you do that in a more controlled enterprise environment. And that really will be stretching many security and legal teams very, very far as we begin to exit out of this immediate crisis mode and return to more of a recovery.
We've been getting some questions on two areas, and let me first quickly say to folks watching, if you see my eyes darting all over the place or my head turning, it's not from lack of paying attention. I'm trying to keep up with a variety of sources from where the questions are coming in and making sense to get it over to our panel. So with now my extended interruption there, let's get back to those questions. We've been getting two sets of questions in a lot right off the bat, and that's on worker productivity and then overwork. And I think they're kind of related in one sense, but let's start with the worker productivity question. How are these companies measuring productivity? Are there differences in productivity is measured between different sectors? And I think that also goes to this technical question of how we can measure productivity and so forth. Helen, let me direct that to you.
Yes, certainly. I think the biggest challenge with any question about productivity is the notion of productivity is linked to the context of the work that you're doing. Most of the way that you can measure it, if you're wanting to measure it from a distance, you have to have data and some kind of data that you're using to measure that. And that's generally going to be time spent and volume of activities. Now, in some types of more routine work, volumes and time spent can be a decent enough proxy for what productivity really is. But it can also create some unwanted behaviors when you only focus on time spent and volume of activities. When it comes to some other types of work, that kind of measurement is such a distant proxy for what people are really doing that it actually can create barriers and backfire enormously for organizations trying to measure that productivity. There have been some very public cases where these kinds of tools have been implemented, and people have gone to the press to say, hey, this is Big Brother, or this is somebody watching, and those programs get shut down. So it's not something to do directly. It's easier when the work itself, and in a sector where the work itself is really activity volume based and time spent based, where there's already a lot of standards, there it works. Otherwise, it's usually better to actually shift the question around from monitoring productivity and going back to what Brian mentioned in terms of setting the outcomes, setting up the conversations around what good looks like, and actually having that conversation with employees on how they're doing in achieving that.
Deb, let's bring you back in to build off that.
So talked to quite a few clients over the last few weeks, and it's interesting the number of clients I've heard say they've got 1 and 2 hour phone calls going on. So definitely things are a little different than they were pre-COVID. And the best advice that we can give on this is to define what are your priorities. Quite a few companies I've been speaking with are not looking at their operational metrics to the extent that they were pre-virus. And so, for example, AHT may be just, something that they're not trying to achieve targets on right now. So the best advice is define what your priorities are and ensure you're communicating that to your employees. Communicate more than you think you need to, because right now, again, in a virtual environment, that's the key to ensuring that everyone understands, how we're supposed to be rowing the boat and what direction we're rowing the boat in. So communicate those priorities. There's also a big issue here of trust. And many of us have sent employees home that have never been work from home, and we may feel like we've kind of lost control a bit of our productivity or our operation, service delivery. The best advice that I can give is, I know of a lot of companies that have done work from home for many, many, many years. And yes, they were able to vet the employees that they wanted to do work from home, but there has to be a level of trust here. And in order to build that trust, you have to ensure that you are relaying what are your priorities, what are the targets you're trying to achieve. Is it more operational? Is it more CX? For those employees that may be doing 1 and 2 hour phone calls, for example, give them a little more guidance on how to control that call, or how much empathy to display during that call. For example, give them a library of good example calls that keep it within the AHT that you're wanting. So trust, try not to micromanage right now. Everyone is going through a very, very challenging time. The more empathy that you can show to employees right now to improve their engagement, to improve their experience, the better it's going to be in the long run. And by removing some of those, tackling some of those employee care needs is going to enable them to be able to serve your customer a lot better. So, definitely trust, try not to micromanage, set your expectations, use whatever processes and technology you need to ensure that people are delivering on the service delivery that you want. But use the lessons learned from this to build upon your go forward strategy of what are the things that you want to define to ensure that you've got the productivity that you need going forward when we're out of this.
And just to build off of what Deb said, the concept of we're going to be trusting our employees, take it, that for a second and look a little bit further into the future in terms of, if you trust your employees now, you're building your employee value proposition, that reason why your employees are working for you. And for the companies that are doing a lot of really good things to empower their employees, to give them options, they're building that employee value proposition really as an asset that they're going to be able to draw on for years to come. If you're not trusting your employees and you're pushing back on every request and you're constantly asking, what are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? That's also taking away from that employee value proposition that you have. And it's also going to convert into your brand in the marketplace as you go start to recruit, because people are going to start talking when we come out the back end of this of how did your company treat you? Candidates are going to start asking, what did you do for your employees during the coronavirus crisis? So we've got to be thinking about that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more about the importance of having trust in your employees. I think to take it slightly back to what Deb was alluding to with the prioritization of key performance metrics of activities being absolutely critical to building that trust, I cannot overstate the need for corporate functions in particular to have those discussions around what are our key priorities. And it sounds silly, admittedly, but what I've been finding is that for many corporate functions, there can be a certain amount of inertia that exists. And there sometimes can be a challenge that many corporate leaders have in adapting to the new, most critical initiatives, most critical priorities that we might be facing in this new environment. And so there is a very real need for many organizations to look long and hard. And as Deb alluded to, with the 2-hour meeting example, what are the critical jobs that we have to get done? Because all too often we see in status quo environments that, you know, legal functions, finance functions, they're doing the job they've always done. Well, we're not in the environment we've always been in, which means we need to take that hard look first before we can begin really emphasizing the right kinds of activities to measure productivity and to ensure that we're all engaged in the right kind of work today.
Adam, let's pull you back in the conversation. As again, you're fielding so many of these remote work calls on behalf of Gartner as we've come into the initial stage here. With this question of this balance, with the prioritization, could you build off what you're hearing and perhaps add some of the things that you've been hearing that maybe we haven't been thinking about right now?
Right. So, you know, one of the things that organizations have been struggling with right now in terms of just the mechanics of remote work is dealing with meetings in a more coherent way, right? So this is basically half my life as an analyst right now, talking to organizations that have transitioned from physical to virtual meetings. And so, you know, as part of that, you know, one of the things that we've seen is that most organizations aren't very rigid. I'm sorry, I don't mean to say rigid, but I mean to say they're not very structured in how they address these kinds of daily interactions you have to have with your colleagues. And as a matter of fact, you know, managers will often sort of skip straight to the point in some of the meetings as they've started to, you know, try to get people to stay productive and move forward on projects, you know, as if the world hasn't changed. And the truth is it has changed quite a bit. And so, you know, what we see now is this kind of new dynamic with, you know, check-ins happening at the start of every meeting, kind of like a social sort of check-in. How are you? How are things going? But on the other hand, right, we're all also grown-ups, and it would be great, I think, if we were asked, you know, how do we want to conduct meetings? What do we think is the best way for us to, you know, interact with each other? What are the things that we know we need to get done? Because overload is an enormous problem right now, whether it's overload in terms of messaging, whether it's overload in terms of meetings, and both of these things were problems before. But the truth is now that people are working remotely, right? Some of us who might have had a commute before, we no longer have that commute. So when do we clock in to the workplace? Well, maybe when we started our commute. And there's this enormous pressure to stay on and online until maybe whatever would have been the end of our commute. And so there are these boundaries that we've kind of failed to establish. And these are things you can solve this with technology in a way by turning it off at a certain time and by paying more attention to your own behavior. But this kind of thing, you know, I think unless our leaders give us some guidelines about what is reasonable, most people, because they're not used to remote work, are going to take it too far, right? And they're going to sacrifice a lot of their lives in service to their work because they don't know what the right thing is now. And they're already under so much pressure to balance their work with everything else that's going on. So that's what I see in terms of, you know, a social implication of the choices we make around our use of technology. And that's kind of a higher level discussion that I think every manager needs to have with their workers, right? How can I give you time to do the work that you need to do? How can I block off time so that when we need to meet, you're having the meetings that you need to have, but you have time to focus on the work that you need to do outside of meetings. Maybe it's to get ready for meetings or to follow up on meetings, right? And how do we take some of the pressure off?
Actually, Ryan, I have a question for you that I'm sure is on everyone's mind. It's a very basic one. It's one we're all wrestling with. I bring it up because, Adam, I'm sorry, I'm going to out you a little here. We never heard the noise, but if you saw some movement over Adam's shoulder, there was some yard work going on. You may have seen me turn my head earlier. There's a very loud garbage pickup going on the street that's over the backside of my fence over here. And so it gets distracting. I bring that up because while we're talking about where to set those limits, where to set boundaries, we also have people that are now our new office mates that maybe don't understand those boundaries, or not always people. It could be a dog barking or something. What are some of the things we have to convey from a managerial standpoint or a company standpoint, either expect or convey as okay from what we might have viewed in the past as unprofessional in a meeting setting?
Yeah, I think it's funny. I had a 3-year-old running up and down the hall outside my office. So, glad we didn't hear that. But I think it just brings it all back home of, we've blurred the work and life boundaries in a fundamental way, and we're not going to be able to go back to that. I think for what we're dealing with right now, kind of near term, because this has been such a macro effect that's affected the workforce relatively uniformly, it's become acceptable. And if you've got a child that breaks in the room, or a dog that's barking, it's not a big deal because we all understand that everybody's in the same conditions. And coming out of this, what we're going to be dealing with is we now know things about our employees, about our managers that we didn't know before. You probably met a coworker's child or seen their dog in their house, and you're not going to be able to come back to that. And it's humanized our workers in a way that we haven't seen before. One of the things that I think is key is what Adam highlighted. I'll give an anecdote from some companies that I've been talking to, is that the guidelines, as we've broken down the commute and the going into the office and those typical boundaries that say work starts here and stops here, it's now this fluid thing where work is going everywhere. And for some companies that I've talked to, they've instituted no meeting times to say, we are not going to allow our workers to work all the time. And they're actually paying attention to those metrics. Like Helen had been talking about, productivity of, we've got people that are working way, way more, and we need to think about that. One last point is some of our advisors and analysts in Australia have brought this to our attention. It's a much bigger issue down there in the collective consciousness, is really around mental health. And I think one of the things that we may see as we come out of this is that the mental health of our workers is going to be a much bigger priority going forward.
And just to add, Ryan, to what you just said, I think that it's so very, very important to ensure that we're setting our employees up for success. And anything that we can do right now to share best practices or lessons learned, or tips and tricks and so forth about how to set schedules, because again, some people are just, they're struggling to even get up, get dressed, and get to work at regular time because they're out of their routine. So how to help them set a structured routine, how to help them set a structured routine with the kids so that they realize when the door's shut, mom or dad are working, and when the door's open, here's the time I'll be able to spend with you. And so, just helping them show empathy to say that I know this is challenging, because again, with the service and support leaders that I speak to, those that are driving all of our contact centers around the world, the number one challenge that they're hearing from the employees is sharing space with either roommates, with a room that has no door, and then the kids running around, and then of course the pets. And so you're right, we are all there, we've all been on calls, we're all hearing the dogs barking, we all hear the kids saying, hey, I want to show you this drawing I just did. Understand that it's okay. And if you go out on multiple websites, you'll see that some companies are out there actually posting that, we are employee safety and health is extremely important to us. So you may hear a dog or a child in the background, but realize, customer experience is still number one to us, but thank you for bearing with us during this time. So today is through this, but it's critical to help our employees be successful through empathy, through setting them up for success and helping them with these processes to manage this. It'll really help in the long run.
Helen, I want to go back to you. You'd been talking earlier about tools for gauging productivity. One of the things, though, we had discussed in preparation for today's panel was the concept of how and when to monitor remote workers. So how do we strike the balance there? And then I can have Zach build off that, because it certainly becomes a legal question, kind of that big brother-esque question, because we have switched the way we work. We often do not sit at 9 and go to 5, but we're stopping, because let's face it, some of us got to get to the store on the few hours we know it's open, and with limited people in that store, get that prime time because a shipment of toilet paper just arrived at that store. We got to go. So how do we monitor without starting to make the employees feel that we're tracking their every move?
It all comes down to purpose. It's why are you monitoring? And it might very well be a security reason. I want to make sure that the person who is signed up to be able to do this work is actually the person doing it. Or I need to protect information that this person is using in their work and needs to be able to share it with others, and we need to protect that, and so we need to monitor that. That purpose is very clearly communicated, and is easy to move forward with. If the purpose is to monitor activities, to be able to find coachable moments, to give some feedback on how to improve, or maybe just some tips on what you could be doing differently in a non-obtrusive or a not invasive way, then that actually can be providing value as well. But you have to be very, very, very clear why you are doing it. And you have to be very clear that the data you are using and the activities you are monitoring will actually help serve that purpose.
Yeah, I think that you point out a really good point there, Helen. There, of course, are legal questions in terms of what information we can collect and how can that be used. And we will not be providing legal advice in this session. Go seek counsel, since there are different opinions and attitudes if you're, say, here in the United States versus in Europe or in other jurisdictions. But beyond what we legally can do, there is that very critical question of what should we do? And there are two places that I find many of our clients need to be focused. One, from the policy perspective. Many organizations have network access, network use policies. However, have those been updated to account for other data tracking, other analytics, other information that you might be capturing about individuals' computer use? If not, we need to update those absolutely as soon as possible. And so there's a huge need to ensure that there is an up-to-date and accurate reflection of what we're doing, and that there's transparency on that front. But in terms of the broader question with what should we do, I recommend our clients always come back to some of the points that have been made already. Is there a really compelling purpose to doing this kind of data capture? Are we treating our employees with empathy and humanity? And can we ensure that they do not feel as if we're in this Big Brother realm? Because we find naturally in these kinds of environments where there's significant corporate change, there is an increased risk of employee misconduct. 4 times as much insider trading happens during significant periods of corporate change. And that could end up creating knock-on effects if we're furthering the burden on employees' minds, furthering this Big Brother kind of visibility or image that we have within the organization. We have to really empathize with our employee population and ensure that they recognize why we would be doing this, and that it is for some very legitimate and reasonable purposes.
Zach, I want to actually build off that with a quick question of what we're tracking and what we're able to track. And let me give 2 examples. We of course we will check how they are, their productivity when they're online doing the tasks we think they're supposed to, if they're in meetings, etc. We also have now an added concern with, we can see people's homes in a way we may not have before, and maybe something appears on a shelf, nothing illegal, but maybe something of their personal life they weren't looking to have revealed in a larger setting. Adam, I know, was mentioning earlier, there's also the concerns of number of devices in a home and who uses it, which also adds to another thing of, we all are taught, rightfully, we do Gartner training on don't let anyone touch your laptop. But what if you're working off the family computer because you do not have a company laptop, and your teenager walks in and does something that in a company setting people say, whoa, what are you doing? You can't go there. And yet they weren't supposed to, you didn't monitor them. How do we factor those legal issues in? And is it just a matter of setting new rules, reevaluating what we may not have had to face before?
I think you hit the nail on the head. We likely will need to approach these situations slightly differently than we had in the past. And we ought not forget, like I had mentioned already, that this is a humanitarian crisis first and foremost. Yes, there are business implications here, but we ought not turn our employee population into automatic criminals for trying to get through the day as best they can. And so I'm certainly not encouraging anyone to have unsafe security practices when accessing corporate assets or anything of the sort. But I do believe we need to approach these issues slightly differently than we would have in a more controlled environment where we can take a slightly more technical controls oriented approach and maybe a little bit harder a kind of approach in terms of where we might hand down discipline as well.
All right, I'm going to first give a, I don't want to call it a warning, a reminder to our audience. We have so many topics that are rolling in. Keep those questions coming, but so many different avenues we can go down, and so many I can go to each panelist on. So I'm not trying to play favorites, so please, to both the panelists and our audience, I'm trying to get to everyone, give everyone equal screen time. That's it. I'm going to come back to Deb with this next question. It's a very interesting one of an overarching kind of our approach on work. For 40 years, the push has been to lower cost via offshore locations. Do you see the challenges posed by this epidemic forcing companies to look at whether it makes sense to push a majority of work offshore? Which that goes to something we'll be talking about later on, is how we reset our mentality coming out of this. But could you speak to that?
Exactly. And with the service and support leaders that we've been talking to the last few weeks, yes, some really struggled, especially in some of the locations in the Philippines and India and so forth, with the government stay-at-home requirements. And I think that this has really brought to light the need to truly partner with your BPO on a contingency plan. BPOs absolutely can bring a huge value to a company for cost optimization. You can leverage technologies, you can leverage resources, bilingual support and so forth. There's a lot of benefits that BPOs can offer. And I think with the economic downturn, I honestly believe that more and more companies are going to be looking potentially to BPOs for solutions for cost savings. So for the go forward, it's extremely important to partner with the BPO and understand what are the contingency plans. I know that some BPOs actually have facilities at their contact centers where they house their employees. If work from home is not an option, then how do you do social distancing in the contact centers? Is it an open environment, or is there something where they can put up some sort of plexiglass to separate the cubes and keep the distance and have safety devices and so forth, and sanitation? So before COVID, there probably was not this discussion. There was just disaster recovery, maybe if there was a hurricane, for example. But now we have to look at pandemic planning. We have to have backups. Do you keep some of your workforce in North America where you can move volumes back if needed? Are there other locations around the world? If you can't do work from home, what are the work from home options? And so I think it's really important when you go into these discussions with the vendors to have a very solid plan and improve your vendor management processes to ensure that you're getting that collaboration and partnership and discussion communication.
Adam, you mentioned earlier in the discussion the concept of looking at the jobs that need to be done, kind of evaluating things in that regard. Do you feel that kind of sense of that's where companies are looking at now and reevaluating, okay, what can be done on a remote basis? What do we need to have in-house? There's a lot of issues I know rolled into that, whether it's real estate and the physical footprint. But in these early stages, what are you hearing from clients as they call in that regard, kind of that longer term outlook?
Yeah, so what we saw, so in a way, COVID-19 has really just accelerated some of the things that we saw when we gathered data about how people worked and how they wanted to work. So, one of the things that we knew, for example, was that people wanted to have fewer face-to-face meetings, and they wanted to have more meetings over audio and video. And we also saw that people wanted to work less in the office. You know, some still wanted to work in the office quite a bit, but more people wanted to work less in the office, and they wanted to have more flexibility. And what happened, of course, with this particular crisis is that all of that accelerated. And so now, you know, enterprises are sort of being forced to transform at a pace for which they weren't ready. And so, you know, what does that call for? It calls for a lot more agility, but to a certain extent, it also forces organizations to prioritize more around, you know, the things that really matter. And so if you were holding off on making decisions, well, now you've got to make those decisions, right? And if you were thinking you had time to do bake-offs between, you know, different vendor applications that were mostly the same in most meaningful ways and cost mostly the same, well, now you're just like, let's pull the trigger on this and move forward. And so I think it is actually teaching people something new about how to really focus on what's important, but also that you can, you know, if you already have a lot of access to technology, you might have been wasting that access. So many organizations, you know, have provisioned people with entire suites of tools. You know, it could be from Google, or it could be from Microsoft, or it could be from someone else. And what they really discovered is, you know, we were using 1/10, you know, the capability of this thing that we bought, but because we have to, you know, move faster, we're going to have to use more of it. And the other thing that it sort of forced them to do in a way is kind of disconnect from some of their old ways of working and the old, you know, on premises based technology. So, you know, this whole crisis has been a teacher in a way, and it's taught us, you know, what we're capable of, but it's also told us to kind of appreciate what we have instead of wasting it.
Actually, the phrase disconnecting from the old way of working leads me nicely into this next question we got from the audience for Ryan, and it's a very straightforward one. What HR policies do we need to revisit during and after this situation for remote work?
Yeah, it's a good question, you know, and I'll build off a little bit of what Adam said in terms of, you know, we had a trend towards remote work. It was kind of increasing a little bit before this crisis, but now that we've kind of moved into this brave new world where we are all, for most of our organizations, working in this new remote world, it's accelerated that trend. We'll go back to work, you know, resume being in physical offices to a degree. But as we do that, and as we kind of think about what that transition looks like, you know, some of those HR policies, you know, what is our remote work policy? How is it enabled? How is it actually approved? Most of the time we see those HR policies kind of break down at the manager level. Managers get scared of it and don't approve it. So there's that piece. The bigger issue that I would bring to the fore that will kind of help you think through the policies that you start to update is having the internal conversations around what do we want to become as a company? What are our values? And how is that going to shape how we incorporate virtual and remote work into our organization? Because for some organizations, they're probably going to go back. It was a thing that we activated at a point in time. And frankly, it helped us at that point, but we're not going to incorporate it. But for other organizations, it's a really big strategic opportunity. If it fits with their values, it fits with the direction they've been going, and we've broken that stigma, particularly around our C-suite leaders, we are able to incorporate that. And there's going to be some big benefits for those companies that do see that as an opportunity. If you can take a portion of your remote or of your workforce and move it virtual, you can decrease your facilities footprint. You can realize some cost optimization. You've had a seat at the table as HR, being able to influence a lot of these decisions. Leveraging that with a cost optimization opportunity is going to be very, very valuable for your CEO and CFO, because we're likely looking at, you know, some kind of an economic downturn. Those are a couple of things that I was wondering.
Helen, I want to pivot back to you and kind of build off that with this question. The original way I was going to phrase it is, should companies build more remote work options into their strategy going forward? I think more and more the clear answer to that is yes. So let me rephrase it slightly to say, are we learning that it's something we need to have as part of our strategy, whether we plan to immediately execute upon it or not as we move out of this COVID-19 crisis?
Well, I think every organization will be asking that question. And one of the things I've been noticing in our conversation today is how much we're focusing on those of us who are really lucky, who get to do remote work, who can work from home, who haven't been told to come back when we reopen maybe. Or we got a question from a CIO today here. I'm based in France, and they had to put their entire IT team basically on half-time work because there just wasn't enough work going around. It was a retail sector company. And he was asking the simple question, how do I keep people motivated when I'm not allowed to connect with them because technically they're on unemployment, and so legally we're not allowed to connect with them, but I want them to feel motivated so that when they do come back, they're really kind of moving ahead with things. And I think what this can tell us is that it does come down to that age-old "it depends" question. And part of this policy work that HR leaders and IT leaders and others are going to need to go through as they examine this is recognizing that it's not everybody gets to do remote work. It's let's work through from our analyzing how we work, how we segment our workforce, how we understand who's doing what kind of work, and actually building that much more relevant employee experience for those different teams and those different types of work that's really relevant to their area. And some areas, that acceleration will go really fast. They'll find that they're actually doing better working remotely, but some are probably suffering from it greatly and will be very happy to be back in the office. So it is one where careful analysis, planning, looking at the type of work, the type of skills, the type of interactions is going to need to be done carefully in some meaningful conversations.
Yeah, I'll add very briefly to say that what I've been hearing is that, those decisions, Helen, and to some extent, Ryan, as you pointed out, those will vary and there will not be a one size fits all solution. But Helen, I could not agree with you more. It's the care and attention that corporate leaders can put into those decisions now that will make a meaningful and lasting impact on the corporate culture that will survive after this whole period of disruption. And so, there is a high duty that business leaders must have in approaching those decisions carefully and deliberately, rather than acting too rashly or in too mechanistic fashion.
I want to build off that in a moment, but first I want to go back to Deb for a question that we got earlier, and it was about tech bandwidth, and it was, any thoughts on staggering working hours across a wider window, say 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., to manage infrastructure and avoiding peak utilization of bandwidth? And I'm realizing it's something like taking white-collar jobs and thinking of it in what we'd consider the olfactory setting of shift work coming in. Could you build on that, please?
Absolutely, and that's a very good point. It definitely can be challenging. I've got daughters home from university. They're using bandwidth for remote classes. Husband's home. We're all, we've got bandwidth issues. I'll tell you that, especially if we're all using video. So it's definitely something to consider. The biggest recommendation is, how can you best serve your customer? Is this what they are demanding? And I do know from talking to a lot of our service and support leaders, for example, specifically within contact centers, it's very interesting. And for those of you that are watching, are you seeing this? We are actually seeing a shift in some of the peak volumes. Typically when you forecast your volumes, Mondays at this time are usually your peak for the week and so forth. But we are seeing over the last several weeks a shift in when those peak volumes occur. And therefore, yes, from a customer perspective, you should be looking at, do we want to shift our times? It may not be all, again, specifically service and support, it may not be all the channels that you would normally support. Maybe you don't do all channels from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. But it's definitely something to consider. Another thing to consider is, do you do some sort of split shifts? Do you do micro shifts? Again, thinking about employee experience, would that help while you're still meeting your service delivery requirements and the volumes and so forth? So it definitely would be something to consider.
We have some questions on both the here and now that I want to get to. One is on hiring. I'm going to come to that in a moment, and Ryan will take that with you. But first, I want to go to one that came in, and it was actually echoed earlier as we were talking about setting those boundaries for people, or where that workday should end or where it should begin. And we had questions of this nature coming in. So let me actually go to Helen with this one. It's about PTO. Is it still okay to ask for personal time off, or is it considered taboo during this time of disruption? What is considered acceptable? I'm a working mom with a 6-year-old and finding that I'm spreading myself thin. Would I be looked down on by management, my coworkers, if I ask for a day off occasionally? What are others doing? Before you answer, let me give that in the flip side, which is I'm sure a lot of employers are thinking, well, wait a minute, you're thinking it's okay to wander off and do your personal stuff. I need you still to do some work stuff here. I need a little bit of structure. How do we strike that balance, and where's the PTO part of the equation come in?
Yeah, I think we're going to see a lot of different activities around that. One is employers saying, you're taking PTO now because we need to get that off the books. We need to de-risk that cost. You're taking it now, if you like it or not. And yes, you'll be at home taking your PTO, but you're taking it. So we'll see that. We'll see some people really raising that question. And I think especially in organizations where they're under extreme pressure and they feel that if they aren't showing up every day, every single minute, the chance that they keep their job is low because they can sense that their business, what they are doing, is really under pressure and may not survive or may really struggle forward. There, the sense is, oh, if I take PTO, will it be seen poorly? There, it's really important for leaders to make the example and really help support people through that, because it may be that in 3, 4, 5 months, we're in a position where they need to accelerate the business again, and actually having taken some time off during this period might have helped everybody perform better when it picks up again. So it's going to be case by case, but I think come back to empathy here. I really need to do that and work with leadership to make sure that that they are thinking about those experiences we are having and really supporting us through that. And sometimes PTO is good. I'm off next week, I must say.
All right, well, I'm glad we were able to schedule this to make sure you were part of the panel before taking that time off. So I do want to turn in a moment to what will look like beyond, whether it'll be a new normal, what we think might change. But I actually want to go back. We got a question. When I said the word, there might have been many in the audience who went, wait, did he say hiring? Doesn't he know what's going on at our company? We're scaling back. But there are companies that find they need either to expand or in most cases just their critical jobs that were not filled yet. Ryan, from the HR perspective, how are companies still being able to go through the hiring process when we're losing that critical ability to bring somebody in to meet with us, to meet with the team face to face?
Yeah, it's a great point. And while we look at the broad economy kind of downturn right now, there are pockets where it's growing. We've redefined what critical skills are and what critical roles are, and companies still need some of those people. So one of the top level organizations have definitely moved their recruiting, their hiring process into the virtual realm. I think we saw this as kind of going back to what Adam talked about, of a trend and then accelerating. Before this, we saw Amazon with a lot of their campus recruiting was moving to virtual. They weren't doing as much in person. That kind of a trend is now applied writ large. We are doing virtual recruiting, virtual hiring. It's Zoom, it's WebEx, it's all of those different tools to get in touch with candidates. To more of the hiring and the onboarding piece, the advice that I have there is, we're in a world where we basically have to do this in a virtual way. It becomes absolutely essential that we understand what those critical touch points with our employees are. We have a great example from Charles Schwab in our HR practice that talks about mapping out those key points on the employee journey as we go through the recruiting process. And I would say as we move into the onboarding process of where do we need to have specific and direct interactions virtually with our people so that they know that they're part of the team, that they're valued, that we incorporate them. We can't do it face to face and do the walkarounds in the office. We have to do it virtually. And understanding what are those critical points for employees. Onboarding is one thing that just about everybody remembers every time, and understanding where those pieces are and what that first month is, where they meet their manager. All of those critical touch points on that employee experience as they onboard are absolutely essential.
We are getting a ton of questions on just about every topic you can imagine, many looking for direct pieces of advice. And I wish we could have hours upon hours more to cover those and give even more detail and so forth. To those who maybe come out of here and say, wow, I didn't really hear that critical bit of information I was particularly looking for, please, there are additional resources we can call to your attention under the attachments tab. And at the risk of sounding with my one bit of sounding like an infomercial at this sake, please don't hesitate to reach out to Gartner. Our panel is representative of the breadth and depth of expertise that's there to help you and field your questions on such a wide variety of topics that this one topic creates. As we move toward the last part of our discussion, we might not feel like it right now, but this will come to an end, the pandemic phase, where we now have to move out and get back to another way of doing things. Adam, I'm going to open this up with you. This question came in from the audience. Do you feel there will be a new normal moving forward? Can we go back to how we did business before, or are we just advancing with remote work now? And the phrase I used earlier was that genie out of the bottle type thing.
Yeah. So I think we'll never go back to the way things were before. And in a way, this is trying to look at the positive side. It will be really helpful for organizations and organizational leaders who are looking for ways to have a better connection with their workforce. And so by this I mean, think about all the events that people are asked to go to. Sometimes it's a team offsite, where you can't get everybody you want. Sometimes it's, a town hall meeting where you've got to pack people into an auditorium. Sometimes it's, training you have to send people away for, or whatever else. But now thinking about how we're virtualizing everything, everything that we would have done in person, we're now doing remotely. If we can keep doing that, that gives everybody better access, provided they have connectivity to everything, right? And so that means better access to your leaders, better access to what's going on in the company and keeping up to date. One of the number one things I talk about these days are the company-wide town halls. And so the idea that we're going from physical now to wholly virtual, at least for a year, maybe a couple of years, will we ever go back to physical again and packing people into a big room? Probably not, right? We'll probably have hybrid events where if people want to be in the room, we let them. But if they don't want to be in the room, we put them, we get them connected in some other way and have all kinds of remote engagement and ways of collecting ideas and hearing what people want to talk about. So, it's hard to imagine that world where we would go back and say it was always better for us in person for every single thing that we were doing. So that's just one example, and certainly when we think about the ways that we're leveraging technology so that we can have better meetings, we're thinking about how we'll be able to give more control and visibility over projects because we were forced to start doing that. Maybe we don't have to talk about the work as much. Maybe we just can focus on doing the work and save time for having other more meaningful conversations. That's what I see happening.
And Adam, just to add to that, I think with the question of will we ever go back to business as normal? No, but I think what everyone needs to think about during this time is, from a CX perspective, have customers' expectations change, have their needs changed? I think it's really important to understand that, and that will help to determine, do we go back to business as normal? Were you able to achieve that through work from home? Were there technology gaps? Were there process gaps, environment gaps? Especially if you have HIPAA or PCI compliance issues and so forth for service and support leaders. So it's really important to focus on how can we best serve our customers. Are we able to do that from work from home? Would we see the cost savings that we want? And then purposefully design a work from home program so that you achieve your business and CX objectives.
Zach, you actually had tossed a stat in there about how some CFOs are already looking at changing an approach post-COVID. Could you bring that up and build off that?
Yeah, sure. We had been working very closely with internal corporate leaders over the past few weeks, trying to understand how they're reacting in this environment and what they have planning coming ahead. And we actually had a group of over 300 senior finance leaders at large corporations and asked them, what percentage of your workforce will remain permanently remote post COVID who were not remote before COVID? And I expected to hear some folks say, we'll have some folks remain remote, just to, in keeping with some of the comments that we can't put the cat back in the bag. What surprised me was that a full 74% of those senior finance leaders were saying that they plan to keep at least some meaningful percentage of their workforce remote who were not previously remote. And you actually begin digging into the numbers, and we find that about a quarter of CFOs who participated are telling us that 20% or more of their employee population will shift toward new remote work arrangements. That's a pretty significant number from a workforce planning perspective, with all kinds of knock-on implications from some of our real estate decisions, as has been mentioned already, to some of the very crucial work design issues that Deb, you mentioned as well. If we're going to be in this new environment where we're going to be working from an increasingly remote arrangement, we really do need to be mindful of the way in which we're trying to foster the right interactions among different functional groups. And I have to say, it's not exactly like the old ways of doing things. The open office environment was necessarily the productivity boon that we were all hoping it might be. So this crisis could be a catalyst for good, but it will require some very thoughtful planning on the part of business leaders to ensure that we can focus on the right jobs to be done and ensure those are being done in the most effective way possible, and in line with some of the comments that were made earlier.
Let's look at some more immediate range planning, and that is clearly everything we're talking about. There's a lot that will change as we come out of this and the years unfold. But take even the question of real estate. It's not like we're going to all come out of it and say, wow, everyone worked great from home, let's just close down the buildings. We have leases, we have contracts, we have a lot of money invested in infrastructure, for example. Plus we have to rethink some jobs and the way we interact with them and handle them. So someone asked a great question. Helen, let me put this one initially to you. How do we prepare employees to that inevitable day when they have to get back to the office after these initial phases have ended?
Well, I think probably the hardest part around that is that's going to be staggered at different time frames for different workers. And then if you're a global enterprise, different countries around the world. I think Adam has spoken to some of our data about 10% of workers really wanting to work from home. And that's the global number. When you look at China and India, it's less than 4%. When you look at France and Germany, it's lower too. So depending on where you are, you might be saying, really, really excited to get back to work and connect with people and be away from my kids. Maybe some people will be feeling that way. So I think just being, again, going back to this theme that we've had throughout our conversation, that empathy, and recognizing that some people will embrace a greater degree of flexibility and will be asking for it. And some people giving them that opportunity to come back and connect and maybe even have some kind of social engagement where they can feel really connected with their coworkers again and feeling like, okay, we're not quite back to how we used to be working, but there is this new normal, and here we're so happy to be connecting and seeing each other in person because we are social beings, right? And so I think there will be a whole navigation step and a lot of planning and a lot of empathy needed through that.
Ryan, let me build off what Helen's saying in this way. How, from an HR standpoint, do we prepare? And I was just thinking as she was answering, we may be faced with what's a reverse situation on remote work. It used to be in the beginning, it's why weren't you letting me work from home? I know early on there was the bad stage of saying it's a reward rather than it's the job you're doing or so forth. We may have a lot of people, to Helen's point, that are now saying, wait a minute, why does that person get to go back in the office and interact with everybody and I'm still stuck back here at home? So what do we have to prepare for from that HR point of view, whether it's policies, whether it's just preparing a mindset to get our staff ready for this new normal?
Yeah, I think being able to, to Helen's point, be able to communicate effectively that this is not going to be a uniform kind of, we all go back at once. There's so many locational factors that will create variety. Within the United States, you think about one corporate office and how many different counties are surrounding that different area, and each one has their own control over stay-at-home policies, schools, all these things that affect it. And it's similar in other countries as well. So I think being able to manage that, communicate it, not that this is just going to be one endpoint in time and we all come back, but this is a more drawn out process. It's going to be slow. I think communicating that is very important. And as we look to that kind of future, thinking about two really critical things. One is that employee experience, kind of thinking where our employees have gone in this process. One was, we've gone through a process of, oh my goodness, we now have to work from home. We've kind of acclimated to it. We've incorporated it where we can. We come back, our employees are going to have more of an expectation that they can do that in some cases. And when I would talk to organizations before the crisis, one of the big driving factors for considering more remote work was, I need to get candidates more interested in my organization by offering it. And I think we're going to see that accelerate, and candidates are going to be more interested in that. And if you kind of play this out in terms of our location strategy and where we engage candidates, huge implications for recruiting. If we have a portion of our workforce that is remote based, how we recruit for those people, how we identify people for those jobs completely changes, because we're no longer geographically constrained. It's a new way of operating for our recruiting functions.
The questions continue to pile up, and we only have a few minutes left. So instead of opening up a new line of discussion here, I wanted to go through each of our panelists for a final thought, whether it's a piece of advice or something you want to especially make sure the audience takes away from our discussion. And in terms of order, it's going to feel random to everybody. I'm going to go on the order I see people and my Zoom panel view here. So Helen, you happen to be up in the top corner for me. I'm going to let you lead us off here.
Thanks, Scott. So I think finally it's really acting with empathy, and empathy to the variability of experience, and seeing how much you can really kind of tailor or understand that people are coming at this through different experiences, and supporting them through that. Some may benefit from being monitored, some because it helps them feel connected and it helps them feel even productive because they're getting that report back themselves. Some will really benefit from having those questions asked and making sure that they know that their employer cares about what their opinion is and what they're feeling. And again, communication. So with empathy around what people are experiencing, the degree of uncertainty we have on timelines and when things are going to happen, really just helping leaders guide teams and everybody through that as we all seek to know what those answers are going to be.
Adam, you're up next.
Right. So in some ways, I feel like this is sort of a forced march to digital transformation for a lot of people, organizations and individuals. And, if I was going to give any advice about this, I would say, if you can look on the bright side as an opportunity here, think about all the new things that you're learning on the job because you have to do more remote work or because you have to collaborate in a different way or whatever else. Think about all the ways in which you can use this opportunity as a way to focus on doing your work in a new way, in a different way, in blocking your time so you can focus on things that are important, in blocking your time so that you can have meetings when you need to, and working on informing your colleagues in ways that keep the whole organization efficient but don't add too much noise to the signal, and focus on increasing your own digital dexterity. Right, that's the Gartner concept of having both the tech savvy and ambition to leverage your capabilities to improve the organization. Right, and so this is your time to learn new things, to automate your routine work, so you can focus on non-routine creative work, and ultimately, what's in it for you, the individual who's listening right now, is increasing your own value to the organization and coming out the other side of this with more skill, with more capability than you started with.
Adam, thank you. Ryan, let's bring you up next for a final point.
Yeah, absolutely. So just two quick things. And one is one that I mentioned before, which is really around, we've gone through this process of shattering the stigma around remote work for a lot of organizations. And we need to start thinking about what is that right mix between in-person work and virtual work. And having a perspective on that issue before we get back into the office is going to be critical, because by the time we get back into the office, our ability to kind of communicate about it, to inform people about where it's going, probably going to be too late. So we need to think about what that optimal mix is ahead of time, knowing that it's going to change over time, but being able to articulate it to the organization and to our employees. And then the last piece is really around the decisions that we're making right now to enable our workforce, to help our workforce, are really building that employee value proposition. They're building that brand in the marketplace. Think about the things that you're doing for your employees right now to build that employee value proposition as an asset that you can draw from in the future, so you have higher retention, so you are better able to recruit, so you are able to answer candidates' questions in the future when they ask, what did you do for your employees during coronavirus?
Deb, let's turn to you next.
So just building upon what Adam and Ryan just said, I don't think that employee engagement, experience, and employee care have ever been more important than they are now. And if you take care of the employees, you're going to take care of the customers. And so really make sure that there's flexibility in your work from home processes, that you're having a little fun every now and then. I hear some companies doing virtual happy hours and coffee time and sharing recipes of the day and things like that. So make sure during all this stressful time that you're all having a little bit of fun virtually too. But again, this wasn't ideal pre-COVID. You absolutely have steps taken to make sure you outlined what the right environment was and what the security requirements were, and workplace safety and everything. And we kind of were thrown into this. So let's take care of the employees. And then, as both Adam and Ryan said, take the lessons learned from this and go through a structure and plan how you want to go forward with work from home. There's, recruitment best practices, and there's, ways in which you set up your environment and so forth. So deal with it now, take care of the employees, and then use this to figure out, is this what you're going to do going forward? Is this how you want to run the business, or do you want to go back into an office? And just keep that communication open. Communicate more than you think you need to, and it will really help.
Yeah. And I'll say, from the broader business leader perspective here, things have changed and they will not return to exactly the same way they were previously. But the three things I recommend our clients do is, first, focus on the core mandate for their functions, because just because we're operating in this more uncertain, more fluid environment does not mean that there is not core critical, mission critical work that needs to be done. But two, we need to determine what must change, both in this environment and what must change going forward. This is a great opportunity to reevaluate the jobs to be done by corporate functions, and also to reevaluate the tool set and how exactly we execute that work. This could very well be the catalyst that we needed to drive digital transformation, as Adam had mentioned earlier, that may have been somewhat lagging in many companies. And third, and most importantly, we need to act. We need to act now, but we also need to make sure that we're acting with some empathy and flexibility, as others mentioned. I know it's much to the chagrin of many assurance leaders within legal or audit or risk management who might prefer to have rigid, reaching rules that expand across the organization. But in this environment, we must be more flexible. We must act with empathy. But most importantly, we must take action now, rather than just hoping to make some decisions once we all return back to whatever new normal might lie ahead.
Wow. I see the questions kept coming in, but we have run out of time. I want to say thank you to a great panel discussion and to those who helped make it happen. Before you go, To our audience, we have a few quick reminders. To watch this panel discussion again, just return to this webpage. While we had no presentation slides, we have included additional resources so you can continue to learn more about this topic. You'll find them via the attachments tab. We've included there some calendars so you can view upcoming webinars as those you may have missed. And trust me, we have plenty on the COVID-19 situation and what you can do about it, cutting across a wide variety of the topics we discussed here today. Additionally, you can download the complimentary resources we've provided, including Leading Ways of Working During and After the Pandemic. Please stay connected to Gartner and access more trusted insights, strategic advice, and practical tools, not just through this crisis, but afterwards as well. Lastly, you could take just a few seconds on your way out to rate this webinar. Let us know what you thought of the format and our discussion. We would be grateful. Please note that 5 is the top rating. We'd greatly encourage a thought or two to drop down so we can get more insight into what you were thinking on that rating. Whatever rating you do give, please remember to click send rating so we're able to gather your insights. And with all that said, let me again say thank you to our panelists, Gartner experts Adam Preset, Ryan Hill, Helen Poitevin, Zach Hutto, and Deborah Alvord. And we especially want to thank all of you for your insights, your questions, but above all, your time. Thank you all for spending it with us today. Have a great day.